Thanks, Magnus. You just put that into context. I've just had the great pleasure of cycling all around Italy, France and Spain for 63 days. Just finished three weeks ago. I cycled on the same day as each of the Grand Tours while the cyclists were going on. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and cycled solo 10,500 kilometres. The reason I tell you this is because when I got home I put a suit on to prepare for this presentation and my pants fell down because I'd lost so much weight. Anyway, it's all very casual anyway, so it's okay. I rang my wife last night to have a chat with her, and she actually asked me, when are you presenting? And I said, well, actually, I've got the great privilege of being in the last session out of 26, and I'm the fourth last speaker out of 134, thinking it was an honour and a privilege. And she took a deep breath and said, "Oh, Tuffley, you're such a loser." And she then asked me what actually follows this session. And I looked at the program and I read out, a group yoga session for those who wish to relax, refresh and reflect. And she said, "Oh, Tuffley, keep it short." And I've given a few presentations in my lifetime, but I must admit I've never stood between 134 speakers and several hundred delegates on the one hand and a group yoga session on the other. So I'll do my best to keep your attention, but please feel free to start early if you wish. Bush heritage. Quick introduction. It's a national non-profit organisation that protects Australia's unique animals, plants and their habitats. This is a beautiful little creature, the honey possum from the southwest corner of Australia. It's tiny, it's 7 centimetres in length, and you'd have to agree it is one of the cutest little animals on our planet. Now we do this by acquiring and managing land of outstanding conservation value to protect as wildlife reserves. We also work in partnerships with other landowners. So this, for example, is Carnarvon Station in central Queensland. It's 59,000 hectares and it was acquired about 10 years ago. And we do it to protect endangered species and to preserve Australia's biodiversity. This is the beautiful northern quoll. It's an endangered species in the northern regions of Australia. One amazing feature about this little creature is that the males completely die off very soon after mating. Now, as we've heard from a number of other speakers, we humans have a lot to learn from our incredible wildlife, and biomimicry is an emerging field of academic interest and expertise. But as much as I love the northern quoll, I do hope the experts do not use that as a role model for us humans, particularly us males. Our history. It was started 22 years ago by a very famous environmentalist, Bob Brown, who many of you would know of. In 1991, he bought several hundred hectares of old-growth forest in the northern parts of Tasmania to save it from being logged and wood-chipped. He had just won an environmental award worth $50,000, and he used all of that money to pay the deposit. And he then sought donations to gather the remaining funds. As a result, Bush Heritage was born. Now, by the way, recently UNESCO ratified 170,000 hectares expansion of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, including these reserves. So these are now the first Bush Heritage properties to receive World Heritage status. And if it weren't for Bob Brown and Bush Heritage, they would simply be wood chips. The next 10 years, Bush Heritage acquired 12 properties across Australia, mostly small plots. And then in 2001, we gained some real momentum and started acquiring very large properties. Over the past 12 years, we've acquired a further 23 properties, totaling nearly 1 million hectares of land. In addition to this, we also protect and manage 2.5 million hectares of land through partnerships with Indigenous groups and other landowners. Now, to put this into context, the 3.5 million hectares of land that's owned or managed actively is nearly the size of Switzerland. This story reminds me of a very famous Paul Kelly song. Paul Kelly's a very prominent Australian singer-songwriter. From little things, big things grow. I won't sing it, but from little things, big things grow. Bob didn't start with a big vision. He didn't start with a vision of 3.5 million hectares under management. He didn't start with any vision at all. He started with a small local problem in northern Tasmania. And he turned that little problem into an opportunity. And in just 10 to 15 years, that opportunity grew into a major program to save biodiversity across an entire continent. Now the reason, or some of the reasons that we've been successful, well firstly I should start with some of the success stories, some of our little critters that have been thriving under management. This is the red-tailed phascogale. Now I apologise to the translators, but the red-tailed phascogale is a carnivorous marsupial, once found throughout central and western Australia, and now found only in the western regions. We've successfully translocated this creature onto our Kojonup Reserve in Western Australia, and there's a small resident population that has been established. The honey possum, you met a moment ago, is a nectar-eating honey. It's tiny. It weighs only 2 teaspoons of sugar, and they have recolonised 60 hectares of replanted vegetation rich with nectar and pollen on the Cherrynup Creek Reserve in Western Australia. The robust greenhood orchid, now this one's interesting. It was thought extinct for 70 years before being rediscovered at our Nardu Hills Reserve in Victoria in 2010. And the yellow-footed rock wallaby, beautiful creature, 5 years of feral animal control at Bulkamata Reserve, it was a former sheep station in South Australia, has meant that the nationally vulnerable wallaby has been spotted there for the first time since 1924. And these are just a few of the great stories we have about the wildlife that we have been able to save and preserve. Now, behind every beautiful critter and plant species that has been saved, and behind every hectare of land preserved for its biodiversity values, there's a wonderful, talented team of people. We have over 70 full-time staff, about 40 of those in our head office in Melbourne, and the rest are scattered throughout the country, some in very, very remote areas and conditions, some with small children living literally hours from the closest town. Our people are our lifeblood, our reserve managers, our volunteers, Indigenous landowner partners who are very important to us, our government partners and our supporters. And we've got a very positive, get on and do it mentality and philosophy. So why do we need private land conservation in Australia? Sally, who I think is in the audience, Sally yesterday gave an excellent and very entertaining presentation about the biodiversity crisis that Australia faces. It's a massive problem and it is extremely complex. There are over 200 million rabbits in Australia, over 200 million cane toads. There's over 8 million foxes. We can't count how many feral cats are out in the country. Pigs, wild horses, goats, water buffalo. It is a plague. It's a common problem across the entire continent, but how we address it differs from region to region, and it depends on the scientific and ecological issues on a local basis, but also depends on the attitudes of the local communities and the nature of the land ownership. So we need a flexible model that is appropriate for the local and unique issues. Governments at federal, state and local levels are all dedicated to this issue, but budget constraints are often a big impediment. In buying land, it is often more effective for a small private organisation than it is negotiating with the government. But you know, most of all, the biggest issue we find is the empowerment of people. It is an extremely effective way to get people involved. We raise $12 to $15 million a year from ordinary mums and dads, not from big family wealthy offices, not from big foundations, not from companies. It's from the run-of-the-mill mum and dad on the street who have become loyal supporters. We employ over 70 people, we engage hundreds of volunteers, and we engage with the local communities. And none of this would be possible if this was just left to governments at any level. So we have found this a very empowering people to involve people locally. I'll run through why we believe some of the factors have caused some of the success. First of all, it's the wonderful supporters that we've built. I've just touched on this. We've got thousands of Australians who donate year in, year out. We need about the $12 to $15 million to support the 35 properties that we have. But importantly, whenever we have a new acquisition, it becomes very, very exciting for our supporters. And we start a new campaign every time to raise the funds, not only for the acquisition, but also for the capital expenditure, for the immediate improvement of the property, and then for the ongoing management over a 3 to 5 year period. Actually, by way of comparison, there's another organisation in Australia called the AWC, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, very, very similar model and also very successful. If you put those two funds together and translocate it to Europe, in a per capita sense, that would equate to around 500 million euros that would be raised from mums and dads, people in the street, on a regular basis purely for buy and hold land acquisition for biodiversity and wilderness priorities. Now, I don't know what is achieved in Europe. That actually may be achieved. It could be better than that, but just to put away a comparison point. The second key point is that we've taken a very strategic approach to our acquisitions. We choose to work on the land based on its conservation values, using nationally accepted measures such as threatened species, bioregions and ecosystems selected as priorities for the government's National Reserve system. You'll recall the presentation that Bob gave yesterday about the Australian National Wildlife Corridors, designed to maximise the impact of the effort and the dollar. We are strong supporters of this approach and strategy, and has allowed us to prioritise our acquisitions and to explain in simple terms to our supporters based on real science. And here's a quick snapshot over time of these are all the properties that we currently own, and a couple of those we also manage. But over time, the acquisitions that have been made, the vast majority of these fit in within the national corridors that Bob spoke about yesterday. And the latest acquisition was just a few months ago, Narree Station. So what is it now? It's a privately owned, continental-wide national park system integrated with other private and publicly owned land, where the total is now worth far more than the individual components. Thirdly, we've been very pragmatic with our approach to land management. Typically, the land we buy is acquired from farmers, so the property is almost always degraded from the impact of cattle or sheep, but also from invasive animals and plants. Fire management in Australia is a critical issue, both using Western and Indigenous methods. It's critical to the natural regeneration of the native species. Out-of-control bushfires in Australia can have tragic consequences in our continent, but in most places it is a natural element and needs to be actively managed. The other ones I've spoken about, weeding is a critical issue. It takes active management to weed, and obviously the feral animals. Science and monitoring. We are very science-based. This is Dr. Adam Carezzi, our freshwater ecologist. He specialises in desert fish. Desert fish. The species found in Australia's remote and ephemeral desert river systems. He's currently working to preserve the tiny red-finned blue-eye fish from extinction. This species is found nowhere else on Earth except on Bush Heritage's Edgbaston Reserve in Queensland. Each reserve has a specific management plan which identifies the key items we want to conserve and the key threats that exist on each property. And, there we go. And this is just another cute creature. I just had to put it up there. The striped-faced dunnart. I don't know how you say that in Spanish, just call it the striped-faced dunnart. And the dusky hopping mouse. They're just gorgeous creatures. Another example, or another critical reason of success and progress has been our collaboration with other organisations to maximise the conservation outcomes and the way we adapt our model to suit the particular circumstances. So, for example, we've got a very exciting project in the Tasmanian Midlands. It's an innovative solution to conservation. The land there is 95% privately owned and has been tightly held for approximately 200 years, ever since the white settlers arrived in Tasmania. So instead of buying the bush, we're partnering with local landowners who want to manage part of their land for conservation values. In addition, we've set up a perpetual fund to provide a secure source of income to provide ongoing management payments for conservation services from landowners. Very important issue for us are partnerships with Indigenous communities. Wayne, I thought, gave a fantastic presentation yesterday about the issues and priorities for his Indigenous people in the Kimberleys, titled "What Kind of Society Do We Want to Build?" Well, we want to work with our Indigenous partners to build the right sort of society, and that's to the benefit of the local community, but also for the ecological reasons. We acknowledge that the country that we're conserving has been shaped by the cultural practices and management decisions of Indigenous people for thousands of years. And to this end, we've sought mutually beneficial partnerships with a variety of traditional owners with particular focus on the northern parts of Australia, and the two key ones being the Wanambal-Gambera Partnership and the Wardakan IPA Partnership. In Australia, our Western cultural thinking has a huge amount to learn from our Indigenous people, particularly when it comes to how to live sustainably on our land and how to create and maintain happy, thriving cultures that can perpetuate without taking away from future generations. Our vision is to double our land under management to 7 million hectares over the next 10 years. This would represent 1% of Australia's landmass, but to achieve this, we need to do things differently, we need to adapt our strategies, and we need to do some things better. First, we wish to increase visitation to our properties. Now, this is a goal in itself, as has been spoken about throughout the last 3 days. It's a real value in connecting people with wilderness. But we also see it as an opportunity for supporters to see and feel and value what we add to our country and thereby encourage ongoing financial support. Secondly, the post-war baby boom generation have been the greatest wealth generators in the history of the world. And by that I refer to money wealth, not necessarily non-financial wealth. Given the average living age in Australia, their children are typically financially independent. So we're seeing a massive opportunity to appeal to these people when they consider where to bequest their personal wealth. We have named several properties in honour of the bequesters, and also, where appropriate, certain landmarks on properties. And what better way is it to leave your name in perpetuity as a legacy of your life? And thirdly, perhaps more controversially, is engagement with companies. We see this as a big challenge, particularly mining companies who can obtain leases to explore and mine the earth under the surface of our properties. We also see this, however, as a potential real growth opportunity. We have not had a history or culture of engaging with companies at Bush Heritage, and in fact we've actually been rather anti-corporate in many senses, suspicious of their motives and lacking understanding of how they think and operate. I'm off for time. I'm also a director of a foundation called the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, and we have successfully engaged with the CEOs of the top 40 companies in Australia to contribute financially to scientific research into the reef and to become better educated about the issues that we face. And we're also looking to launch a reef bond, which would be issued to the capital markets to raise capital from professional investors to support our scientific research projects. It has a way to go, but it's a way in which we're trying to engage with companies and with the capital markets. I'll finish off as quickly as I can with a story about a reserve that we purchased 10 years ago. It's got a lovely ring to it. In 2003, a good friend of mine, Chris Darwin, who happens to be a great-great-grandson of Charles Darwin, he inherited some money from his family and he wanted to use it to buy some land for biodiversity and wilderness values. So we worked with Chris to find some land, and we found some land in Western Australia, 68,000 hectares, the size of Singapore, and we bought it for $300,000. That's $4.37 per hectare. Now, you can't buy a cup of coffee and a muffin for $4.37, but we're able to buy a hectare times 668,000 for this price. We also embarked on a very active patrons program whereby people effectively acquired or supported plots of land. We divided up into 37 plots. My family has become one buyer of a plot, and we have a beautiful photograph in our office where we proudly show people who visit and to prove to them that we own in perpetuity, because we donate every year to the management, to this biodiversity hotspot. And it's got a great ring to it because it's in a biodiversity hotspot region of Australia. I love saying to these people when they come into the office, look at this, we own a bit of biodiversity hotspot, have you got one? So it was just by coincidence that yesterday, as we sat here last night with the Wild Music Medley, that Bush Heritage celebrated our 10-year anniversary of the Charles Darwin Reserve, called the Blues for the Bush concert. And we had nearly 1,000 people travel from Perth, 350 kilometres away, to attend this concert. And we had site tours, we had sustainability talks by academics and rural leaders, various kinds of kids' activities in tents and wildlife spotting games, a slow food tent. And as the sun went down, this is literally the same time as we were here last night and a few hours before, as the sun went down and under the super bright stars of the Milky Way in the southern skies until after midnight, listening to this fantastic music. It really was, in effect, an outdoor version of this event, albeit we did forget one thing, and that, of course, was the group yoga session. I hope that gives you some insight into bush heritage, and thank you for your time.